May run out of battery soon.
Oh.
Here's where we get into something that's a little bit controversial. How do we look at some group like Anonymous or Lulzsec? Lulzsec started out by hacking the PBS website and putting up fake stories about Tupac Shakur. And last night, Lulzsec brought down part of the CIA's, internal internet. Now, I would probably make the analogy that, pranksters like, the yippies are always fun when they talk about tweaking the nose of power. But the yippies used to joke about throwing LSD into the water supply. Well, of course, that was all humorous. If they had ever done it, it was not only a felony, it stopped being funny. And the problem you get in cyber pranksterism is that there is a point at which it becomes questionable whose interests you are serving. There becomes a point where the act of computer assault becomes an act of dissociated violence in and of its own right. And I am not by any means trying to, damn the whole hacker community, but it's useful to note Robert Morris was one of the first guys to do a worm on the internet. And Robert Morris's father worked for the NSA, and the NSA later popped Robert out of jail by having him do a deal to come work for the NSA. And NSA and FBI regularly go to the Black Hat hacker conferences. So who is someone working for when they claim to be an independent hacker? The only reason I even put this missile defense thing in here is to make clear that this plays an integrated role, particularly the distributed tactical missile defense we're seeing in Asia and Europe right now, in linking together all of these systems of localized drone warfare, cyber warfare, and prompt global strike. And the ultimate goal is to be able to use space-based vehicles for a lot of these kind of global strike-type weapons as supporters of regional missile defense and regional cyber warfare as well. I think I just got a few more. This is to point out, I don't have to tell anybody in this crowd, yeah, we've got a new national space policy, we've got a new national security policy. Of course it's different from what we had under Bush, but it's not that different from what Madeleine Albright had to say about unilateralism when we must. This is about as good as it gets, and it's not all that good. This is a thing that Bill and I and the other members of CEPA started talking about, and Bill might want to interject in here in a minute because I think it's something that we're going to have to mull over a little while. We try to compare the activist role as a good example from that of the Good Samaritan, and we don't use Good Samaritan as a nice term, as much as some biblical scholars might get mad about that. If you're acting as a good example, you might find ways to help nascent struggle movements in the Middle East or elsewhere through social network support work. The fantastic work that Matt and Linda Percy and others have done to build up the cause of Jeju Island on Facebook and elsewhere is a shining example of what you would call good example work. But notice what that means. You can be the media, you can be the change, but you have to think long and hard about when am I being the gun? Because if you notice in the New York Times last Sunday, it was revealed that the U.S. government is using several covert methods to increase availability of the internet in nations where that's been shut off. But at the same time, the U.S. government is working on its own kill switch to kill off internet services here or elsewhere where it doesn't want to. It's a process of the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. But as we move to Good Samaritan activities, this is where governments are more likely to operate, where they say, I gotta go help. Well, France has been the lead proponent of responsibility to protect. And the old line is, look at Rwanda in 1993. Do we want that situation to happen again? If we see genocide, shouldn't we come in? Well, there are points where you could say that. But when you decide to move to the weapon, not even boots on the ground, but even like a bombing campaign of the Libya type or an assault cyber tool, you start drifting into the law of unintended consequence. Matt, you.
Really quick, I don't know what the next slide looks like, and I don't want to take any
Go
time
ahead.
out of your talk, but there's an interesting in-between area here, because when the riots were taking place during the Iranian elections, the Mousavi campaign, I'm not a computer programmer. I mean, I know my stuff, but anybody in here could have did what me and Kelly did. And me and Kelly took part. We dedicated 2 computers in our house to a distributed denial of service attack, which is the same exact style attack. We're not talking, that CIA crash wasn't anything elaborate. That was a distributed denial of service attack. That's called a DDoS. A DDoS attack simply is imagine all of us sitting in this room at these computers, okay? And let's say we didn't like the CIA website. Each one of us goes to this computer and we type in cia.gov and we click refresh, refresh, refresh. We keep refreshing the browser, launching the page, and launching the page, and launching the page. And we downloaded a simple program at the house. My 2-year-old's sitting on the couch watching cartoons. We have 2 laptops open on the coffee table, and they're blasting the Iranian presidential website. And we did that with thousands of other people when we dropped the website.
Yeah.
We had another program that we downloaded that we turned one of our computers in the house into a proxy server for people in Iran to be able to relay, so they could post and have access to the internet without it being able to get traced back to them. And these are programs that not a single person in this room wouldn't be able to download and use. So there's the good example, the Good Samaritan, but any one of us in here could take part in some of the little, depends on what your principles are. But we were totally fine with it.
The principal issue is an interesting one, because you will see at the end of this, there's only a few more slides, and then we're going to move it over to David, that we kind of make the suggestion that DDoS is at least provocative, if not a potentially violent act. But I'm not trying to tell people that Matt is, participating in violence or anything like that. Here's an interesting discussion made. I kind of almost flunked out of nonviolent communication classes with our local peace group, because I said, sometimes I choose to use my jackal voice. I have not banned my jackal voice. I choose, my mind filters what my heart and my hormones are saying, and sometimes even after a 10-second thing, I will say, I choose to stop dialogue with this person and call them a violent name. And it's because I have made a conscious choice that I'm taking out my jackal voice. I would suggest that deciding to participate in a distributed denial of service attack is a conscious choice to take out your jackal voice. And sometimes you may see it as necessary, but you have to think about it, the implications very carefully.
Yeah,
Phil,
I just want to make another, it's probably pretty obvious, but when governments use cyber war, and let's say the U.S., they couch that as defensive. But for every defensive use, there are probably 2 or 3 offensive uses where, take the bombing of Serbia. Nobody could figure out why no planes were shot down. None of them were even shot at, except one with a rifle. But they had totally silenced that system because it had some cyber dependence. But in all the current situations, the U.S. is doing its best to layer in a cyber component to whatever act of war they're doing. It's part of the denial mechanism. It used the phrase force multiplier. It plays that role in almost all U.S. actions in war. But ever since they put up the sign that it's the Defense Department, those by definition are always defensive, and they're defending against the bad use. And so you have to just kind of keep that in mind before you start using the word defense.
Yeah, and I've only got about 3 more slides left here that'll bring up precisely these issues of what myths do we have to go against, and how do we have to think about the way we do things. You know, one of the biggest words you're going to hear all the time from, the Pentagon and everybody else is asymmetrical warfare. And it means different things depending on which side of the telescope you're on. Because if you are an established state power, you will look at an individual group who decides that, they can use human shielding or a certain amount of things, and that, oh, well, they're not playing by the rules of warfare, so it's okay to violate their human rights because they just forfeited their human rights. That's a new notion that one can forfeit one's own human rights. But if you are a rebel group, you will say that, the established states have such a huge asymmetry of power versus little groups on the ground, individuals or whatever, that it's okay to kind of cheat in how to get things done. And the real answer to that is, this is reality now. The only kind of war we are seeing anymore is either global nuclear war, in which we're all wiped out, or asymmetric war. There is no battleground between organized armies anymore. Those days are gone. And so when we decide to invade a nation, but then we see that a lot of armored personnel carriers are blown up by IEDs, hit by cell phones and stuff, we go, well, that's not fair. Well, guerrilla war isn't supposed to be fair because it's the war of the powerless against the powerful. And yeah.
I actually would call it state terrorism.
Well, yeah.
We are state terrorists.
Yeah, terrorism originally was used as a word to describe the behavior of the state, and it's only been in the 60s and 70s that it was shifted over to talk about individuals. So. Oh, okay, we're almost done, and maybe we'll take one question or two before David starts, and then, but I want to make sure that all gets in there too. You know, this is a really, really important point as regards drones or, you know, very advanced, high intelligence problems of microswarms of satellites and drones, is that you can use a technology advantage you had today, but the narrow window is narrowing every day. And you saw the development of relatively complex, cheap IEDs that used cell phones for control. That didn't take any of these groups in Iraq long to figure it out at all. It won't take them long. You know, Charlie Wilson's war didn't take anybody in Afghanistan. It was later part of the Taliban movement to get their hands on RPGs. They can get their hands on all these technologies. Some nuclear arms control groups, who I have always heavily criticized, Wisconsin Arms Control Project, for example, think that there is legitimacy in saying we need to keep certain technologies out of the hands of the bad guys, and so therefore we're going to put all our efforts into anti-proliferation movements. Okay, but number one, you're assuming that the people that have those technologies right now are good guys. And I don't think anybody that has nuclear technology, for example, is a good guy at all. So there are no good guys in this war.
Right.
Number two, you end up promoting things like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or the Missile Technology Control Regime, which are dirty and rotten and wrong at their heart. So you have to plan everything you do under the assumption that all these technologies will be in everybody's hands and that none of them are antiseptic. They will all involve heavy, huge casualties. And again, this is the toughest one. I'm still working on this, trying to figure it out. But if you are a citizen engaging in assault in a means short of war, you become a de facto warrior. I wouldn't mind being, I was involved in some more minor Iranian projects, and I wouldn't mind getting involved in a DDoS attack. But it's like choosing to take out my jackal voice. I may flunk nonviolence as a means of that, but it's because I chose to flunk it. Because I chose to play a cog in a wheel of being a warrior. And I think anybody in the peace community needs to think long and hard about how they do it. So this is setting the moral stage a little bit, and I'm going to hand it over to David in just a minute. Any concluding thoughts on that, Bill?
It comes to mind here, and it's a perennial question, and you got to how difficult it is. I really like Joe Gerson's presentation this morning. It informed me. But behind it all, it says that that's the real world, and we can only tinker with it at the edges, and that's sort of what this is saying too. I remember a professor at Colorado College, he